He's going to do that. So we have our fourth and the way we're doing things today and tomorrow, our final session for today. We will have one extra session tomorrow, and I'll send instructions about that as soon as I can after the last session. But basically, we'll have a slightly shorter lunch. We'll go a little bit longer tomorrow afternoon. And Shashir is going to chair this session. We have Justin Clardy.
I don't know if you wanted to say
anything. Okay. Go ahead.
Cool. So before we begin, I just want to sort of thank you, Mark, and the lovely people here at USC for bringing us to convene together to talk about the end of romance and breakups. What I'll be talking on today is a paper of mine that began back in 2014, and so I really do appreciate the occasion here to share, have updated it, revised it a bit, to share it with you all. As I was sitting in the peanut gallery, the title of my talk got quite the commentary, In the Wake of Romance. People were a bit confused. I should say that In the Wake of Romance takes a note from Christina Sharp, who writes a book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. The wake becomes an image for the sort of trail of water that is left as a boat or ship passes through it. And it creates like this wide V-shaped thing, if you will. And I think it's a really useful visualization for contouring things that still remain within context or certain confines after something has passed, right? And so that is sort of what animated the rather obscure philosophical title, but a bit more poetic. And I think we're doing philosophy of love, so that should be okay. So without further ado, I'll get into In the Wake of Romance, or romantic afterlives. Suppose with me that Paige and Jordan have been romantically involved for, I don't know, roughly 6 years or so. As we might expect in mononormative societies, their lives have become, in all the familiar ways, intertwined. They have mutual friends. Their families know, and dare I say, like one another. Jordan knows things about Paige that almost no one does. Old traumas, social media passwords, their insecurities, facts and features of their past relationships, fears and insecurities about their career, etc. Paige knows much the same about Jordan. We might suppose that for several of the years that they have spent together, they have also imagined their futures together. Eventually, however, the relationship ends. As a stipulative point, let us also suppose that the breakup is a genuine one. By that I mean neither Paige nor Jordan understand themselves as still in a romantic relationship with one another. Neither necessarily desires for the other to change their mind. Also, neither party has extracted a promise concerning whom the other may date next. And, importantly, I want to assume that each possesses the moral freedom to leave the relationship. Now imagine that a few weeks later, Jordan begins romantically pursuing Paige's closest friend. Jordan maintains that Paige and I are broken up. I am no longer their partner. They do not have a say, or they do not get a say in whom I date. This response gets something right. Breakups are and actually should be able to end a relationship. If ending a relationship were to leave one permanently subject to the same romantic demands that governed the relationship while it existed, then it would be difficult to see what ending it, or in other words, breaking up, could amount to. Ex-partners do not retain an unlimited say, if they ever even had one at all, to be sure. They don't get a say over one another's intimate lives or choices. But Jordan's response is also incomplete. Even if we see Jordan's relational freedom, we might still think that Paige is not positioned toward Jordan's conduct in exactly the way that a stranger is. We might think Jordan owes Paige some consideration here that Jordan would not owe to an arbitrary person. Importantly, we can think this without believing Paige owns Jordan, without believing the former relationship continues, and without believing that every former romantic partner possesses such a claim. My concern in this talk is how we should explain judgments like these. Philosophical literature on love and personal relationships has had a lot to say about what relationships give us reason to do while they exist. For instance, one familiar thought about personal relationships is that they can generate partiality. Describing personal relationships, Alfred Archer and Catherine Robb write that personal relationships give rise to, quote, legitimate reasons and perhaps expectations for partiality, end quote. Romantic partners may have reasons to care for or consult one another, protect disclosures shared in confidence, provide emotional support, participate in shared projects, as we heard a little bit about earlier, and weigh in one another's interest in deliberation in ways that they do not need to for strangers. But we might reasonably wonder what happens to this normative architecture when the relationship ends. One answer is that breakups function as a kind of normative reset. While the relationship existed, each person occupied a special position in the other's normative landscape. But once it ends, those relationship-specific reasons and obligations also disappear with it. I will call this the clean break view. On this view, once a breakup has occurred, whatever obligations remain between the parties must be explained by some independent fact, perhaps an explicit promise, a shared child, a legal contract, a friendship that survives the romance, or the ordinary duties that all persons owe to one another. But the former romantic relationship itself has become normatively inert. But I do not think this view is correct. Instead, I maintain that a breakup can terminate a romantic relationship without eliminating all of the normatively significant structures that the relationship produced. Relationships can have what we might call relational afterlives, enduring structures of vulnerability, standing, and social entanglement that can continue to shape what former partners owe to one another. My argument is not that having dated someone is sufficient to generate obligations that bind one to them forever. Shared history is, by itself, too thin. Some former partners really do become, for the most part, some former partners really do become, for most morally relevant purposes, strangers. The central question, therefore, is not whether we owe our exes something as if exes name a uniform moral category. Instead, the better question is which former relationships leave behind normatively significant structures, what kinds of structures do they leave behind, and what reasons do these structures continue to generate? I'd like to suggest something that, for now, I am calling the persistence view. On this view, the formal dissolution of a romantic relationship changes the parties' normative relationship, often dramatically. But formal dissolution and normative disappearance are not the same thing. Where relationally produced structures continue to organize the parties' vulnerability, standing, or social world, limited and context-sensitive obligations can persist as well. Where those structures no longer remain, the corresponding special reasons disappear. The view, therefore, attempts to hold together two claims that are often treated as competitors or in tension with one another. First, people must have the genuine moral power to leave a romantic relationship. And second, leaving a relationship does not necessarily erase everything that relationship has made morally salient or significant. The clean break view is not without critics. Some of the recent philosophical work on relationship dissolution has begun to challenge the idea that breakups propel former partners immediately into moral strangerhood. Monica Betzler, for example, develops an ethics of divorce partly because the ordinary literature on special obligations seems ill-equipped to explain the breakup process. As she observes, if the relationship was what grounded special obligation in the first place, it may seem that ending the relationship ends their ground. Yet, as Betzler writes, quote, that view would leave divorcing partners in a normative vacuum, end quote. Her response is to defend residual duties of explanation, participation, and assistance that obtain through the process of dissolution. Ultimately, Betzler grounds these residual duties in the parties' prior commitment and the forms of trust and vulnerability generated by that commitment. Richard Healy makes a related point. On Healy's account, breaking up is an exercise of normative power. It is something people can do that intentionally transforms the normative structure of their relationship. But exercising that power does not delete the entire structure at once. As Healy puts the point, a breakup can fundamentally restructure a relationship without instantaneously dissolving all of its normative requirements. Quote, only the passage of time and the gradual disentangling of Jamie and Fred's, names that he uses, disentangling Jamie and Fred's lives. He writes of his central case, will achieve this result. I agree with Betzler and Healy that breaking up is not analogous to a magic wand, as it were, right? Wouldn't that be nice? There is no reason to suppose that the immensely complicated normative architecture built through months or years of intimacy disappears in its entirety simply because one person sincerely utters the words, I am ending this relationship, or more colloquially, it's not you, it's me. I also want to push beyond both accounts in a particular direction. Betzler is primarily concerned with duties in divorce, which she mentions as a caveat, or mentions in a caveat as a stand-in for the dissolution of even non-marital relationships, or otherwise obligations that structure the transitional process through which a committed relationship is brought to an end. Healy likewise understands breakups as initiating a transitional phase in which some duties disappear immediately, some remain temporarily, and the parties acquire reasons to disentangle their lives. Healy writes that this transition allows parties to quote, disentangle their lives, adjust their plans and intentions, and recalibrate their emotional responses and practical deliberations, end quote. This much seems right to me. However, my question begins where the language of transition threatens to run out. What if the relationship is over, and yet some of the structures it generated simply do not disappear? What if the parties have, as I call it, relation shifted? That is, transitioned out of romance, but one still possesses extraordinarily intimate knowledge of the other? What if their families remain intertwined? What if they inhabit the same tightly knit community or polycule? What if one remains specially vulnerable to conduct by the other that would be relatively innocuous if performed by a stranger? In cases like these, we need to distinguish two things that sometimes get conflated: the continuation of a romantic relationship on the one hand, and the persistence of normatively significant products of that relationship on the other. This distinction has a rather illuminating analog in Becky Millar and Pilar Lopez Quintero's work on grief and continuing bonds. Their concern is bereavement rather than breakups, and I do not mean to collapse these phenomena. But the conceptual maneuver they make is helpful. Millar and Lopez Quintero argue that the death of a loved one need not mean that every element of the relationship simply vanishes. Love may continue, elements of interpersonal influence may continue, the deceased may continue to structure choices and self-understanding. At the same time, they resist simply declaring that the original romantic relationship persists unchanged. Their aim is instead to distinguish which elements continue and which ones do not. That, I think, is the question we should ask about former romantic partners, or exes. The relationship can be over while things produced through it remain. One might be tempted, at this point, to reduce the argument to a rather simple one. Perhaps we owe things to former partners because we have a history with them. But this is too quick. Consider two cases. In the first, I dated someone for 6 weeks when I was 19. 20 years have passed. We do not speak. We share no friends. Neither of us remains particularly vulnerable to the other. I know very little about the person they have become, and they know very little about me. In the second case, two people end an 8-year relationship 3 months ago. They continue to work in the same department. Their closest friendships overlap. Each remains close to members of the other's family. Each knows intimate details about the other that are not publicly available. Their social lives, identities, and practical circumstances remain significantly entangled. In each of these cases, the relata, a word I use to sort of represent the participants of a relationship, in each of these cases, the relata have shared histories. Still, it would be strange to infer that because both possess the property of having been formally romantically involved, that each former partner stands under the same kinds of strengths of obligation. Hence, I think we do well to resist grounding post-relational obligation in historical facts alone. There is an important difference here between my view and Betzler's. Betzler does not claim simplistically that history by itself generates duties. For her, again, commitment establishes trust, and that trust renders the parties vulnerable. Nevertheless, she ultimately says that the residual duties involved in divorce are grounded in the fact that the parties were once committed and came to trust one another's commitment. I suggest that the explanatory center of gravity moves forward in time. The fact that I once occupied a relationship with someone matters normatively insofar as that relationship has generated something that continues to structure our situation at present. This, for me, is the persistence view. A former romantic relationship generates distinctive post-relational reasons when and to the extent that relationally produced structures continue to organize the parties' vulnerability, normative standing, or social practical lives after the romantic relationship has ended. Several qualifications are in order, of course. I know you guys were wondering, like, what did he just say? Yeah, no, here comes the qualifications, okay? First, these reasons are domain specific. An ex's standing concerning my disclosure of their private information does not give them standing over my career, my clothing, or my future romantic choices generally. Second, these reasons are scalar. They can weaken as the relevant structures weaken. Third, they need not be symmetrical. One former partner may possess information or social power that makes the other especially vulnerable without being similarly vulnerable in return. And fourth, persistence is not itself a reason to reconstruct the former romance. On the contrary, respecting someone's relational freedom may require accepting that the relationship has ended, while nevertheless taking seriously the things that ended it have not erased. What then are these relational structures? I want to briefly discuss three: residual vulnerability, relational standing, and ongoing social entanglement. I'll take the first of these in turn. Residual vulnerability. Intimate relationships make people vulnerable to one another in ways that are not easily reversed. Part of intimacy consists in granting another person forms of access that we do not typically grant indiscriminately. A romantic partner may learn about your shame, your sexual history, financial difficulties, the state of your mental health, what makes you insecure, etc. Breaking up does not produce epistemic amnesia, as it were. In other words, we do not simply forget these things when we break up, no matter how much we'd love to sometimes pretend that we never met our exes. Thus, we might be able to make sense of a continuing obligation of confidentiality after a relationship has ended. Suppose that during their relationship, Paige told Jordan something intensely private and that they entrusted to them in the context of their intimacy. After their breakup, Jordan casually discloses it to their new partner. It would be a very strange defense for Jordan to say, "But we broke up. I no longer owe you anything." right? And this is a rather common phrase that we hear when we break up with people. Oh, I don't owe that person shit, like whatever, right? And I think it was that sort of folk intuition that motivated this entire project, right? So it became sort of, one, it's just simply not true that we don't owe exes anything. We surely owe them the same things we owe to strangers. But the more interesting question becomes whether or not we owe exes something beyond what we owe to just strangers, which I'm trying to make the case for here, right? It is that the relationship put Jordan in a position of information that leaves Paige particularly vulnerable to them now. This allows us to explain both persistence and limitation. If the vulnerability remains, the reason remains. If the information ceases to be sensitive, or if Paige discloses it publicly themselves, I don't know, maybe on their Facebook story or something, right? The relevant reason may weaken or also disappear. Millar and Lopez Quintero give us a way for understanding how intimate relationships leave these kinds of traces. They describe a central feature of loving relationships is, quote, mutual shaping, the way in which lovers play a role in guiding and altering one another's identities, concerns, and self-concepts, end quote. Their concern is with how such shaping can remain significant after death, but their underlying insight, I think, travels rather well. Relationships do not merely place two already complete individuals beside one another. Intimate relationships can change the people who participate in them. This is why breakups can also be so destabilizing. When much of one's life has been built around a relationship, shared friends, children, activities, living arrangements, quote, various areas of your life might begin to unravel after a breakup, necessitating an extensive rebuilding, end quote. The relevance of this point is not merely psychological. If our intimacy has partly produced the conditions under which one of us is now especially exposed to the other, that relational production can matter morally. Residual vulnerability, therefore, explains one class of post-breakup obligations without suggesting that former partners retain the rights of current partners. We're going to move to relational standing. Next, there might be a structure which I am, for now, calling relational standing. Relational standing concerns not merely whether an action harms one per se, but whether one occupies a position from which they have a distinctive claim to object to what their ex has done. This is the structure doing much of the work in the opening example between Paige and Jordan, right? When he pursues the ex, or pursues the friend. Return to Paige and Jordan. 2 weeks after ending their 6-year relationship, Jordan begins pursuing Paige's closest friend. Suppose there was no agreement governing post-breakup dating. Suppose further that neither Paige nor Jordan believes former partners own one another's future romantic lives. Why then might Paige nevertheless possess a complaint? The answer is that some relationships generate a limited normative authority concerning conduct whose meaning is inseparable from that relationship. Paige's standing does not amount to a veto, and Jordan need not seek her permission. Paige is not entitled to demanding lifelong celibacy, for example, prohibiting Jordan from forming another romantic relationship, or generally to direct Jordan's intimate relational future. But it also does not follow that Paige's relationship to Jordan's conduct is indistinguishable from a stranger's. The timing, the identity of the friends, and the structure of Paige's social world all matter. The former relationship matters because these facts can make Jordan's action one to which Paige has special, partialistic claim to consideration. This kind of standing is familiar in other relationships. Friends can appropriately object to some forms of betrayal that would not be a stranger's business. Family members may have claims concerning the handling of shared family matters that random observers lack. The point is not that these relationships generate total jurisdiction over one another. They generate local forms of authority and accountability. Former romantic partners or exes can sometimes occupy such a position as well. What if we varied the Paige and Jordan example? Suppose Jordan dates Paige's friend 15 years after the breakup. Paige and Jordan have not spoken in a decade. Their social networks have almost entirely separated. Paige has long ceased to organize any important part of her life around either Jordan or the old relationship. Intuitively, the complaint now shows up much weaker. Why? Not because the historical fact has changed. Paige and Jordan it would still be true that Paige and Jordan would have dated for 6 years. What has changed is Paige's normative position relative to Jordan. Whatever standing was initially produced by the relationship may have attenuated as the structures supporting it disappeared. This is one reason to not produce post-relational obligation. This is one reason not to reduce post-relational obligation to commitment. Commitment is a fact about something the parties undertook in the relationship. Standing is a fact about how they remain positioned toward one another afterward, in the wake of romance or in their romantic afterlife. So talk about that third structure now, that ongoing social entanglement. A third structure is ongoing social entanglement. Romantic relationships are often imagined dyadically, as if two individuals enter a private container that can later be opened up and emptied, which I think Ellie's commentary early in the presentation before mine was getting at, right? Opening up that space. But our relationships are part of and build social worlds. Relata sometimes come to acquire relationships with one another's friends or families, become connected. They join communities together. They co-parent or become part of professional networks, establish routines and traditions. They share social political spaces, sometimes religious communities. Breakups can terminate the romance without dissolving these social networks. Here, Healy's language of disentanglement is useful. On his view, the breakup begins a process through which former partners adjust plans, intentions, emotional responses, and practical deliberations. But sometimes disentanglement is incomplete, and other times it is impossible. And sometimes it is not even desirable. Two former partners may both legitimately remain members of the same community. Neither inherits their friend groups by default, for example. In such circumstances, the parties may owe one another forms of restraint that strangers do not. They may have reasons not to weaponize mutual friendships, monopolize their common spaces, like, I love this coffee shop and you know that. Disclose private information to shared acquaintances, or force friends into unnecessary adversarial loyalty tests, fun as though they may be. Again, the claim is not that any particular rule follows automatically. The account on offer is context sensitive. The point is rather that social entanglement can itself constitute a continuing normative structure. Hence, this is why We Are Broken Up sometimes fails as a complete moral defense. It articulates an important fact, that the romantic relationship is ended, but it does not establish a further fact, that the social world generated through that relationship has been completely formatted. Returning again to the initial puzzle, why might it be objectionable to pursue the close friend or even sibling of a former partner? The answer needn't be that former partners retain proprietary claims over one another, nor must we posit an implicit promise or say that all former partners possess permanent romantic rights. The wrong, where there is one, can instead be explained by the persistence and interaction of relational structures. Exes may remain especially vulnerable. The conduct may occur inside overlapping social networks whose shape the prior relationship helped create. Exes may retain a limited form of standing to object because the action derives some of its meaning from the relationship that has only recently ended. This might also help explain why superficially similar cases yield different judgments. A 6-week relationship may generate very little persistence. A 20-year relationship may generate much more. But duration is not itself determinative. And an intense short relationship can generate serious vulnerability, And a decades-long relationship may end after years of prior disengagement, such that little remains. But the point I'm trying to make here is that time matters primarily because persistent structures often decay over time. Here, Pilar Lopez-Quintero's criticism of Betzler is helpful. Lopez-Quintero worries that an ethics of breakups can become too focused on rational deliberation, explanation, reason giving, opportunities for joint assessment, per se. She suggests that, quote, breakups should be framed as care contexts that require attentiveness and moral imagination, end quote. In my view, post-relational ethics also requires attentiveness because there is no single package of duties attached to the social category of the X. To know what one owes a former partner, we have to attend to the particular shape of the relationship and, more importantly, to its aftermath. What access or vulnerability remains? What social structures, forms of standing, or forms of authority remain? Which have clearly ended? Which, if any, have not? These are questions that can be answered by knowing simply that, these are questions that cannot be answered by knowing simply that two people used to date. There might be an objection lying in wait. Perhaps the persistence view simply gives former partners a philosophically respectable vocabulary for refusing to let go. An ex who wants to control someone's future can now say, I have standing. Right? Someone unwilling to accept a breakup can say, our social entanglement persists. Someone jealous of a new relationship can redescribe jealousy as residual vulnerability. Any plausible ethics of romantic afterlives must preserve the possibility of genuine exit. This is what Betzler calls relational freedom, roughly the moral freedom to refuse or leave a committed relationship. She argues that the value of romantic partnerships themselves depend on the possibility that our partners freely continue to choose us rather than being normatively trapped with us. Healy similarly treats breakups as a normative power capable of fundamentally changing the web of relationship-based duties between the parties. I accept both of these claims. The persistence view should therefore be read as constrained by what we might call an exit condition. That is, no post-relational obligation can simply reinstate the general relational authority that the breakup was morally capable of terminating. Thus, there is an important difference between saying, you may not date anyone else because I remain your partner in some normative sense, and on the other hand, saying, given the particular vulnerability and social circumstances that remain between us, you have some reason to take my interest into consideration before doing this particular thing in this particular way. The first denies exit, the second seems compatible with it. We're getting through it. I don't know. I'm not gonna get it. Sorry. Indeed, Lopez-Quintero's discussion of breakup chatbots makes the danger of denying exit. And that paper is actually really interesting. If you haven't read it, I encourage you guys to sort of read Lopez-Quintero's paper on breakup chatbots. Indeed, Lopez-Quintero's discussion of breakup chatbots makes the danger of denying exit particularly clear. She argues that some attempts to maintain continuing bonds after a breakup become morally problematic precisely because they refuse to recognize the former partner as a living person who has exercised their power to leave the relationship. The persistence of what she calls imaginal or emotional material must not be confused with an entitlement to continue the romantic relationship unilaterally. This constraint lies near the center of my view. Romantic afterlives are afterlives precisely because the romantic relationship has itself ended. This allows me to address an important limit case. Suppose the former relationship was abusive. It would be a mistake to say simply that abusive relationships leave no persistent structures. In fact, abusive relationships may leave some of the most durable forms of vulnerability and social entanglement imaginable. The victim may remain economically exposed. The abuser may possess intimate information. Shared communities may remain organized around both parties, or the victim may remain psychologically or socially vulnerable to the abuser for years. But it would be perverse to infer that because these structures persist, the abuser therefore retains standing to control the victim's future intimate life. This shows that persistence alone is not sufficient for every kind of post-relational claim. I'd like to add then that the relevant structures are also directional. Where one former partner possesses information that could harm the other, the persistence of that vulnerability may generate obligations for the person who possesses the information. Where one party's standing was itself constituted through domination, coercion, or abuse, breakups may appropriately extinguish precisely that authority. Betzler herself recognizes a related point when she argues that in some cases of serious prior wrongdoing or abuse, ordinary residual duties can weaken or disappear altogether. So my claim is not, wherever anything from the relationship persists, duties persist in both directions. Instead, it is that persisting relational structures can generate domain-specific reasons whose direction and weight depend upon the morally relevant position each party occupies within those structures. This may prevent the persistent view from romanticizing romantic residue, as it were. Some things left by relationships are not bonds worth preserving. They are vulnerabilities requiring protection, powers requiring limitation, or entanglements requiring careful navigation. I'd like to conclude by turning to what I think is one of the broader implications. Part of what makes post-romantic obligation appear puzzling is a familiar picture of mononormativity, according to which intimate authority is both exclusive and serial. On this picture, while Paige and Jordan are together, Jordan occupies the relevant privileged position in Paige's intimate life, and Paige occupies that position in Jordan's. Then the relationship ends, and the slot, as it were, becomes empty. Eventually, another person may come to occupy it. The picture of the relational landscape that this paints is almost hydraulic. Normative importance flows out of one relationship before it can properly flow into another. But there's little reason to think that our relational lives actually work this way. People actually inhabit multiple normatively significant relationships at once. Friends, family members, children, lovers, former and new relata can all generate claims. The existence of one does not entail that the others have disappeared. This is where I think a mononormative conception of intimate life has distorted the problem. Mononormativity encourages us to conceive of intimate normativity as necessarily organized around one authoritative romantic dyad at a time. Once a new dyad exists, any residual claim from an earlier romantic relationship can appear illicit or moot simply because it competes with the current one. But this seems to simply beg the question. Suppose Jordan begins dating Sam after separating with Paige. Jordan now has reasons generated by this new relationship with Sam. Perhaps Jordan owes Sam forms of honesty, consideration, care, and support. But why should the existence of these reasons entail that every reason Jordan has concerning Paige become morally unintelligible or irrelevant? In fact, they may conflict or differ in weights, or perhaps Sam's claims might often win. But conflict between reasons is not evidence that one set of reasons cannot or does not exist. Non-monogamous relationships, such as polyamories, help see this point because they begin from the possibility that multiple intimate relationships can simultaneously generate legitimate claims. Once we abandon the assumption that relational normativity must be exclusive in order to be legitimate or authoritative, there is nothing theoretically anomalous about obligations that overlap across past and present relationships. Again, the point is not that exes are somehow secretly still our partners. It is that our normative lives are diachronic and dynamic. Relationships reorganize us, they expose us, connect us, and position us in one another's lives in unique ways. Any subsequent relationship does not necessarily eliminate those facts any more than a new friendship erases every obligation generated by an old friendship. Post-relational normativity can therefore be overlapping without being equivalent and non-exclusive without being unlimited. I began with the question of what gives Paige standing to object to Jordan pursuing one of her closest friends. One possibility is that nothing does. Perhaps the moment the relationship ends, Paige simply becomes normatively indistinguishable from any other person with respect to Jordan's intimate life. My position has been that this conclusion moves too quickly. A breakup has genuine normative power. It can terminate the romantic relationship. It can release the parties from important duties of romantic availability, exclusivity, or joint planning, for example. But breakups do not necessarily produce normative closure. Romantic relationships sometimes create structures that outlive them in how they make us vulnerable, give others forms of access to us that strangers lack, or position us inside of shared social worlds. Throughout this talk, I have tried to maintain that they sometimes give us limited standing concerning conduct whose meaning depends upon what previously existed between the parties. When those structures persist, some reasons can persist with them, not because history acts as a kind of magic. The fact that one once loved you, once dated you, once built a life with you is not by itself sufficient to indefinitely govern what either might do. The morally relevant question is what that history has left behind. This shifts, or should shift, how we think about exes. Ex-partners are not members of a single moral category. One ex may appropriately become almost entirely a stranger. Another may remain a co-parent. Another, a friend, a member of one's community, someone to whom we remain especially vulnerable, or someone who possesses no legitimate authority over us, but nevertheless owes us a stringent duty because of the vulnerabilities the relationship has produced. So instead of beginning with the question, as I did in 2024, what do we owe to our exes? I think we should ask something, and can ask something a bit more precise. What survives the relationship? Who remains vulnerable or entangled because of it? And which forms of normative significance can those surviving structures legitimately bear? On the persistence view that I've tried to advance here, the moral work of breakups, and therefore on the persistent view that I have tried to advance here, the moral work of breakups are therefore neither to pretend that nothing has changed, nor to insist that everything has disappeared. It is to determine with some precision what the end of a relationship actually ended and what remains in its wake. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna start calling numbers 4, number 1, number 2, Barrett, Mark 3, Quill 4. All right, number 1.
Thank you so much, Justin. I loved it. So it was really illuminating. And
Thanks. I hope it cleared up the title for you.
It did. It was worth waiting for. Sometimes suspense is the perfect strategy. Yeah. So my question is about a worry that I have that I feel like your account shed light on. It might just be part of the moral landscape of dating and breakups, but I wonder what you have to say about it.
Sure.
So it strikes me as right what you say that after a breakup, exes retain within certain parameters standing that's normatively significant in particular domains, in virtue of vulnerabilities, things like that. And it strikes me as right that to the extent that your lives are more entangled during the relationship, that standing that they have is correspondingly expanded in some important sense. It seems right. The more entangled you are, the more standing you have. But then I guess I'm worried because it seems all else being equal bad if after a breakup you're so entangled with your ex that for a certain amount of time, say across a wide degree of domains or a wide number of domains in your life, right, your ability to make certain decisions or your autonomy in some sense is hampered, right? That seems bad. But then I'm thinking that if that's bad, that then gives you a reason when you're dating the person to be protective about how entangled you get with them and how much of your life you share with them because you don't want to risk potentially the relationship ending and you're being significantly hampered in these ways that cut against your autonomy interests or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. But that seems like it would be a bad result because then it would be really hard to build trust or develop robust relationships with people. So I wonder what you want to say about that.
So one thing that I'd say about that is I'd probably pull the string of yarn on what we mean by robust here. Sort of toward the end of the talk, you hear me or see me drawing on non-mononormative types of relationships, particularly polyamories. And I think that amongst polyamorous community, you find that folks report on having a wide variety of relationships that they consider robust that may not share or embody the same forms of mononormative entanglement that we see existing in, say, traditional or conventional marriages. Some of these relationships are, in fact, long-distance relationships where the kind of entanglement that you have is maybe emotional or something like that, but materially super separate, right? People live in not just in different homes, but in different states, so on and so forth. And they talk about these relationships being robust to the degree that these relationships allow them to both have companions as they travel along in life without having to sacrifice some of their self-autonomy that we see kind of happening, whether it be sort of like intentionally done through the traditional mononormative sense, or something that just kind of happens as a way of endorsing sets of norms, like we were talking about earlier, going to the same coffee shop with the same person 3 times every however many weeks it was, right? And so for me, I guess I'd want to use this framework to expand or trouble what we mean by robust and not treat robustness as a zero-sum game that has to be preoccupied, or that that is preoccupied with the only way a robust relationship can look is this sort of more traditional, conventional, dyadic, monogamous relationship where things are hyper entangled, so on and so forth. Now, that robustness may have to be made out in reference to different values, but I think this framework opens that conversation of relational plurality in ways that we can find or talk about value and the ways that other relationships are valuable without having to be cornered into just stamping the traditional mononormative model. Does that help?
So the thought, just to say back to you and tell me if I'm tracking, is like you want to grant the problem that I raise and say that's a reason in favor of actually like partitioning your investment across more relationships so that any individual one risks correspondingly less of your autonomy or your projects if it torpedoes. Is that the thought?
Potentially. I mean, I think the language that you just used is talking about sort of like pollinating across multiple relationships, whereas I'd frame it as preserving whatever you might extend in those relationships. Because sometimes polyamorous people are single, right? Or sometimes polyamorous people only have one partner, right? But even the ways that we might understand them as moving through that singlehood or through that relationship that they have that is just one is in a way that they're hyper conscious of not allowing themselves or their lives to become so entangled as to just merely reflect this, right? So there just may not be more than one relationship present at that time, but I do think what you said is consistent with or compatible with something that I would endorse.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's kind of like prioritizing yourself, right? People, there's this thing called like solo polyamory, right? People write on this, right? Where they talk about themselves as being their primary partners and then every other relationship being secondary to the relationship that they have with themselves. And perhaps this provides for us a useful model for thinking about healthy or unhealthy forms of entanglement across our relationships.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I liked it a lot. And I really like what's the term? Relationship afterlives?
Yeah, okay, yeah, relational afterlives.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I like the 3 structures that are left in a wake of a relationship.
Mhm.
My question, so this is just a genuine question, and I might have missed it from the talk. Is there anything in those structures that generates a scope within which you're gonna kind of bound the kinds of consideration somebody might owe to an ex. So it seems like it's one thing for me to say, well, like an ex, like I should be mindful of how my dating their best friend or somebody else, like how that might affect them.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering if those structures give me reason to be mindful of that, might give me reason to be mindful of other kinds of considerations as well, and whether you feel okay about that or not. So I don't know, if we owned a house together and we split up and like settled up on the money, but then I decide later to bulldoze the house and I don't know, build a Starbucks or something that I know would be like especially, like it would just break their heart to know that I had done that. Do I have an obligation to take that into account in the same way that you've been talking about throughout?
Yeah, to the degree that the relational structures that you shared with them exist, I'd say so. Right now, and we were kind of talking about this, I think, during the poster session, right? Like, I'm still actively working through like how exhaustively we ought to consider and what makes out the terms of that consideration. I do not yet have that. But one thing that I think, what I can say is, I don't know that I want to be conservative about that, precisely because I think that mononormativity as a social as a way of organizing the social world creates artificial divisions between self and other in ways that stoke competition, that stoke the degree to which we perceive others as threats, so on and so forth. So there's a sense in which I think that the more liberal I can be about whatever that scope is, would extend outward to perhaps improve the ways that members of the same society come to relate to one another in more caring and compassionate ways, precisely because we would be closer to dissolving rigid boundaries between ourselves and others based on the fact that we shared a romance or something like that. That's just a first pass. Yeah, I'm not committed to that, but I that is something I'm wanting to explore.
Just for what it's worth, I really like that and agree.
Thank you.
I think a lot of folks might have an intuition that says you get to have a say about like who I date, but you don't get to have a say about these other things.
Yeah.
It seems like if I'm hearing you right, you're saying you're comfortable with maybe casting the net wider in that way. I think that's really worth pursuing. That sounds
Especially if casting the net wider means that we are coming to consider others more in caring ways. I don't think that's an outcome or a consequence that I want to resist. I welcome that. Right?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think
Oh.
Would like three or four?
I thought I was next, but go ahead.
Well,
I'm not in a rush. Go.
go ahead.
I probably forgot. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that I love this.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I got very distracted.
I was nervous.
I got very distracted by the rule of history in a kind of quibbly way. So this is kind of like a small beans question. But I'm totally persuaded that it's not all about history, it changes over time, doesn't, all that stuff. But the question I got sort of fixated on is it ever the case that history is really required, and like how intimately is it required? And I sort of distinguish two different things in this sort of friend dating case. So here's one layer. And one layer is that we've got to do to everybody not to harm them, or not to egregiously harm them. And it just turns out that that because I've been in this relationship with somebody for so long, that dating their friend 6 weeks later is going to egregiously harm them. And so it's sort of like if I have mud on my feet, everybody else can walk on the carpet, but I can't walk on the carpet. And that's not because history has something to do with how I got mud on my feet, but it's sort of a very shallow way. And distinguish that from a sort of another layer that might happen in the same sort of case. It's not just the duty not to harm, but there's specifically, you were talking about the way in which we have these entanglements, now we have to split them up, okay? And now it looks like dating somebody's friend is sort of a move in sort of carving up more of what we're divvying up. So like maybe we split the money on the house, but now I'm like taking over the friend group by dating the friend who like was their friend, and now I'm dating them, and now it's like a hostile move in that kind of space. That looks like it's about equity and the distribution of the divvying up. Which seems to me like it maybe depends more on the fact that there was the history, because it wouldn't be an equity in the divvying up unless it was the thing that we'd shared. So that there, the history seems slightly more important. It's not by itself.
Yeah,
It's only an ingredient,
yeah,
but it might still be necessary. Yeah.
and that's fine. I think that a consideration of history is just not sufficient to ground it, right? I don't want to necessarily reject the necessity claim, because the whole paper is about the fact that these folks did once have a relationship together in a particular way. I do want to sort of ask for a little bit, if we may go back and forth. Why would it be unequitable as a part of the divvying up? So, or a move in a sense, because I guess I hear that as a decision being unilaterally made. But if we're satisfying the condition of consideration, I'd imagine whatever these three friends are, I guess Sam, Jordan, and Paige, would have a conversation, right? It's not a decision that I could make on my own, right? Like, especially if, you know, we take Jacob's account seriously, that we have to make this sort of performative act and I have to get prepared. So yeah,
I wasn't sure how to think about it exactly.
Okay.
I just was offering it as a foil to the harm version, where
Okay.
the harm version, it seemed like the history was involved, but in a very shallow way,
Yeah.
like the mud on my shoes way.
yeah, I
Whereas
got you.
in this way, it seemed, and I was thinking of some other cases that were more different from this case.
Yeah,
Where, like in the intimate disclosure case,
yeah,
I was thinking about a stranger on the train who overhears your intimate disclosure, and then they know these things about you.
I see. Yeah,
But
yeah,
But that's different. I was thinking like a partner might have benefited from learning that in a way, or be responsible
Yeah.
for how they came to know the intimate thing. Whereas the stranger on the train who happened to overhear you, where I thought that responsibility might be a thing
Mhm.
that gives you extra duties over it, that somebody who happened to overhear it doesn't have.
Yeah,
That was another example I was thinking of, where the history might be
Bigger
more
role.
involved in the shape of the duty. Yeah.
yeah, good. Yeah, no, that's, I agree, I agree. I think, in the literature, I think scholars have had a tendency to, in many ways, overdo the discussion on history. I mean, I follow Clardy in a lot of what Clardy has had to say, but I think he's also one that kind of makes that spills a lot of ink on the history. And what I don't often see is, so like in reading that literature, it can kind of read sometimes as like, okay, it's because of the history and nothing else. Right. And that's what I'm trying to, that's where I'm trying to push this debate a little bit further. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on anyone's toes. So I really enjoyed this and
Thank you.
I think I pretty much agree with all of it. And I found a lot of the details very interesting. But and I especially enjoyed your exchange with Barrett just a few minutes ago, but I sort of wanna push a little bit as on why the original puzzle feels like a puzzle at all and whether it
Okay.
actually is one. And I actually kind of suspect you might just be sympathetic to this push in the end, but like, you're not the only one who thinks that there's something that needs to be explained as to why we would still have you know, special duties or special normative reasons to treat exes a certain way.
Mhm.
And it kind of feels like a bizarre, it feels bizarre to me that this is paradoxical because just in general, when humans become normatively entangled with other humans in any form at all, those normative entanglements are temporally extended and evolving and they don't go away overnight. And that doesn't seem to be anything special about romantic relationships to me or about breakups. Like that's just how normative entanglement works. And you know, other things that end, we don't expect that they end the normative entanglements, right? So like if I stop renting a place from a landlord and then that relationship is over, and then, you know, 3 years later, my landlord finds out there was asbestos in the place, I feel like he has some responsibility to like tell me that, right? Like, you know, it's not like, well, I'm not their landlord anymore, so it's not, like just in general, this is just how these things work. And in terms of the particular case of, you know, who you get to date, I do have a point I'm leading up to here, but like, it's not just with exes that we have something like that kind of standing, right? Like this happens in my friend group all the time because my friend group is overly close and I might say to somebody, and I have done this in my friend group, like, oh, for the love of God, please don't start dating this other person in our friend group because it's gonna be messy and it's gonna make things terrible for like me and everyone else, and including you guys. And like, I have some standing to say that. I don't have a standing to like order them to not date the person, right? But I have some normative standing. It just doesn't matter that I've never been involved with either one. And that leads me to a suggestion, which is that I feel like a lot of times we generate a sense of paradox around this kind of obvious fact about human relations by overemphasizing duties and obligations as if they're the only normative statuses that exist, right? There's like all kinds of, Margaret Little has great work going back decades on this. There's all kinds of other normative statuses and claims that are softer than duties and obligations that can make this feel less paradoxical. So like, I don't have a duty to not date my ex's friend if they tell me to, but I have some normative reason to, right? And they don't have the normative standing to impose an obligation on me or a prohibition. They have the normative standing to sort of like draw on our normative entanglement and let me know how that would feel. And I think that like, once we don't frame everything in terms of duties and obligations, then this whole category of problems can kind of seem obvious, which doesn't take the value away from what you did at all, because like all of the details you went through, I found super helpful. But I just feel like the overarching puzzle shouldn't be a puzzle at all. It just is kind of obviously how humans interact, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I do agree with that 100%. I also do think that, these are things that we find abound across human relationships. If I may make a sincere disclosure here, I'm a long time, at this point, I don't want to date myself, but I'm a long time philosophy of love and sex scholar, And I mean, I think a lot of the literature that has found large uptake starts from a particular place.
Right.
And in order to engage it, you have to frame things in particular ways. Ultimately, I want to write this paper to get folks to exactly the points that I'm getting here with you and with Barrett, right? That's where I'm going, right? I've written a lot on non-monogamy where I make similar points that these are all artificial problems that are manufactured from mononormative social orders, where we can talk about patriarchy, we can continue to talk. And I mean, this is but another way of trying to reach an audience and bring them toward those same conclusions. A lot of the things that you mentioned, I often find that not everyone starts from the same place, and it can be useful to and for me as a writer to find new avenues for expanding those types of insights. I mean, that's the only thing
and
I
that's
can say.
totally legitimate.
And then I find it leaves duties and responsibilities at the door.
That's absolutely legitimate, but like, it's interesting how I feel like to deny your basic thesis rather than the details that you spelled out, you'd have to be so dehumanizing, right? You'd have to just be like, the minute I break up with somebody, my ex is like not a person who is situated within the normative space in which we all operate. And that's such a bizarre thing to think. And by the way, when you said you were gonna date, you didn't want to date yourself, I thought you meant in the poly sense.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd be great.
That's really what I thought.
I'd be great. I'd love to date myself in that way. But no, I mean, to this point about sort of dehumanizing, right? Like over the last however many years, I do find not so much in scholarship, sometimes in scholarship, there's been some exchanges between Chalmers and York, for example, that have gone back and forth that, I mean, again, it's not a whole bunch of mudslinging, but sort of in chat forums, on Facebook, on all kinds of social media, Reddit and things like this, you do find that people who have more pluralistic views about valuable relationships coming to be associated with beasts, so on and so forth. I mean, and this is not new, right? I mean, Reynolds v. the United States in the late 1800s associated, right, multiple relating or plural relating with Asiatic and African peoples as a way of sort of calling it anti-American, so on and so. I mean, so you're absolutely right, and I I don't know what more we can continue to do to try to move that needle, but I am committed to it at the first, second, and third order.
Thanks.
So, okay, we have more time, right? I'm gonna add 15 more, 10 more? 10, okay. 10 more minutes. Those you haven't, okay, 1, 2, 3.
I'll start with a joke, I guess, but wouldn't it be nice if we could just eternal sunshine of the spotless mind our ways? Yeah. How should I phrase this? I guess gonna turn the question quite literally inward. So in a very general sense, we have obligations to one another. We have an obligation to treat one another fairly, of course. And I do think that, of course, the nature of the obligation towards the ex is rather peculiar. And I do agree that that's, of course, contingent upon the length of the relationship, the amount of closeness that was achieved, et cetera. You have to take into consideration historical context. I guess my question is, to what extent can you speak about the obligation to the self as it relates to the relationship? And I have here in mind Kant's doctrine of virtue, because Kant posits that we have a duty to cultivate our own moral personhood, that we have a duty to strive to moral perfection in spite of the fact that we're never actually going to get there. Like the idea of moral perfection functions as like a regulative ideal, and it's like, what if you get in a relationship and things go a certain way and then it ends, and then you think to yourself, all right, I could have been a better partner, is it time for me to sit down and look inward and read Freud or whatever and ask myself, how can I be better next time? And I was wondering if you can speak to that.
So I will try to do my best. I think the part of your commentary that grasps me is this question about what duties do we have to the self, right? And
As it relates to the
ex,
breakup and the ex,
I mean, so it perhaps is unsurprising that what I'll have to say here is going to resemble what I was saying to Barry. Like, it's that this discrete sense, or it's conceiving of the self as such a discrete type of entity that I think is something that ought to be overcome because of the ways that it maintains these artificial barriers between self and other. That is, I think, what prevents large-scale societies from embodying things like caring democracy, as Joan Tronto talks about, or I don't know, like the compassionate society that Nussbaum talks about, so on and so forth, right? I don't think that we get closer to those ways of being if we do not loosen our attachments to, I don't know, like notions of selfhood that are so rigidly discrete that they oftentimes come at the expense of considering others in particular sorts of ways, right? So for me, I'm just going to, I hope that speaks to it.
Thanks so much. This is first a comment on what Quill said, because I think, even though I completely agree that like people talk way too much about relational duties. I also work in the area, and I was like, oh my gosh, stop talking about relational duties and talk about like enticing reasons, being told, being motivated. But I think all of your cases are indeed duties. Like, you do have a duty not to disclose like more information. If you decide to date your ex's sister, like right after you break up, that's not just a dick move. Like you
technically, no.
And also, like, like if you're like, let's divide friends, like I'm gonna like manipulate our friends, so come to me, so you be left lonely. That's not just like a reason, a enticing reason or like a standing to do this. There is an obligation. But my disagreement is about the nature of these duties. It seems to me that insofar as these are duties, they cannot be impartial in the way that you describe as.
They are partial.
Partial in the way that you describe, that like beyond, above and beyond what you would owe to a stranger. So think about the standard case of like what we owe to people around us and what we owe to stranger. You could say that, oh, my friend's collapsing in front of me. Or like someone here is collapsing in front of me. I have a duty to help them. But of course, I would have of course, I wouldn't have this duty to help like someone across the Atlantic Ocean, like if they were to collapse there. It has to be in the context of what I can reach. They have to sort of enter the space, be in the relevant situation for me to help them. But it doesn't seem like the friendship itself is what grounds this duty for me to immediately go to their assistance. There is just a general duty of like immediate assistance if someone is collapsing in front of you and you're right there. And here's my explanation of why the three cases that you give are just impartial duty failures. So the first case I think is more straightforward. Like if you're my boss, I have a moment of like, I don't know, drug-induced hypomania and started sharing everything about my life and you hear it and we work together and I was like, oh my gosh, panicking. You have an obligation to me to do the secret keeping. And it's not that like there's any special relationship between us. Like we're not in a relationship, we're not even friends. You just have this duty to me because we coexist in space. And in the second case, which is very interesting because I think the second case of relational status can be like the duty failure there can be reduced to a special duty to the people who you are at least causally responsible in harming, not necessarily wrong. So suppose I have a colleague who's in a relationship. And through some of my action, I haven't decided what, like even though innocent and very well intentioned, I caused them to break up. Then knowing that I have destroyed her relationship, I now have a duty to not pursue her ex-partner, right? Like that would be such a, like, it's not, it's like.
Duty you think there?
I think so. I think like there are cases where you are just, I don't know, their literature talking about, you know, like
that to me would seem super derogatory, honestly.
Okay. It's really?
Right? I mean, so I cut you off. I want to get to the third case. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I could maybe explain a bit more. Like, so for example, if I made a mistake and screwed up someone's interview, I think I then have a duty not to like in a very aggressive way take over the interview and be like, okay, make me the candidate. I don't know. It seems like something in our social contract that like we just owe this to each other. Like, I don't know, but that's just my intuition. But the third case about like divvying up friends, and it seems like Mark and we don't have a special relation. We're not friends, right? We're only calling friends. We're not friends, sorry. But like, it would just be really weird, and then not just be really weird. I have an obligation not to be like, if you're friends with Mark, you can't be friends with me. Like, leave him for me, right? Like, it seems like these duties are all of a more generalized kind to me.
Yeah.
So, like, but I want to stress that I really like the cases, and I completely agree with the cases.
Yeah.
I just disagree about the nature of it.
Yeah. So I'll try to take as many as I can in turn, and before we run out of time. I think the first thing was about sort of like somebody falling over in front of you, and I guess I'm thinking here between sort of like there being a distinction between sort of like emotional need and then like physical need, right? Or emotional vulnerability and physical vulnerability. Whereas it might be the case that it's very easy to identify someone in physical need while we are sharing the same space, right? We're not all across the Atlantic right now, so on and so forth. I mean, yeah, I think that is a general duty, but I think when it comes to thinking about particular actions we might undertake that might acutely harm or, you know, emotionally harm some other person precisely because of some fact about a history that we have shared, and then the emotional or the relational structures that outlive that. I don't know, I do tend to think that that is sort of a partialistic duty, and I don't know that we can owe that to strangers precisely because we would lack the relational historical condition. But I'm fine, I'm with you on the physical thing. The bit about the causally responsible, oh man, I forgot. So the causal responsibility point,
Project. There's like 2 more minutes.
okay.
So like if
Well,
you can,
We'll do it
you
later.
can
We can-
continue
we can-
this
sorry.
over the dinner. We probably won't have time for fourth, but like the third.
It was I.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
So wait, do I have time?
Yeah.
Okay.
30 seconds.
Yeah, man, it's like, okay, so I agreed with, I was like, just saying truths over and over again. Then it
You know, in
was,
the flesh, no, I'm kidding.
then I was like a little bit horrified by the solo polyamory.
Horrified.
Yeah, in the sense that I was like, and I think it's gonna make sense with my question of like, in the sense of prioritizing the self over others.
Yeah.
And I guess the question that I had was, I was just curious of like where you're gonna fall in this, and I think maybe I also have a lot of sympathy with the previous comment. So it might come from a kind of not that caring much about autonomy place for me, but like if you hold all these reasons for having these duties in some cases, like it's gonna be a duty, not just a reason. If there are no other countervailing reasons, it seems like, no, you should not sleep with a friend. If like it was just because you were gonna do it for fun and like you shouldn't sleep with the best friend. It seems like that's gonna be enough. I was just curious what you think about reasons for remaining in the relationship. And you spoke about this, you gave the bad cases at the end of your talk for, yeah, no, this doesn't commit me to thinking like cases of the terrible relationships.
Right,
But it,
abusive, yeah.
yeah, but it feels like there's these other cases where like, I've been 10 years with this person and I'm bored, and I want something new. And it feels like, I feel like if I'm motivated by your cases for caring for my ex and all these ways and all the normative entanglements, I might also be motivated to think, no, I should actually stay and try to not become bored in this relationship. And I was just curious where you fall on this. Do you think there's cases where not just I owe duties to my ex, but I owe a duty to the person to not make them my ex and to stay for precisely the same kind of normative entanglement and vulnerability and stuff that was driving the ex stuff?
I mean, I think what I can say here in very quick time, is there's going to be a distinction here. So, and I know this is going to be unsatisfying. I don't know how much of that hinges upon sort of like, when you say, I guess I want to be more clear about staying in the relationship or staying in a relationship of a particular kind or in a particular mode, right? Because I don't know that there would be reason to stay in a romantic relationship, whatever that might mean, right? But if we're talking simply about staying related to them in ways that there are maybe dependencies that exist, but that relatedness can take the form of something that we socially identify as a friendship or something like that. Perhaps there might be reason to remain connected as opposed to in a marriage or in a romantic relationship or something like that. I don't. Does that speak to it?
I think that answers my
Yeah,
question.
yeah. Because for me, I'm a deflationist. I again, putting my cards on the table, I'm a deflationist about romance, right? I think that romance is it's a socially constructed like norm that we apply. We can talk about this at dinner, but yeah, it's not a super robust count of like, romance is really like, no, yeah, it's not me. Yeah, there's a very thin line between romantic relationships and friendships for me, period. I think we relate to people and we ought to be relating to them as best and as caring as we can.
All right, let's take a